Hi everyone, so my name is Beckley now, and today I'm going to be talking about the Penobscot Nation v. Frey. This is a water rights dispute over the main stem on the Penobscot River up in Maine. It's surrounding the Penobscot Nation's reservation up there. This is an ongoing suit, so today I'm going to be talking about both the Penobscot Nation v. Frey and the previous suit, the Penobscot Nation v. Mills. So just to give you guys a little bit of background, the Penobscot River is a part of a major river system up in Maine that stretches most of the state. There's a lot of recreation up in that area, rafting, canoeing and kayaking, fishing. And then there's this one section called the main stem where several branches of the river actually join, and it's a really large section of the river. So the Penobscot Nation has a reservation lands up there, and they've had access to this water for a long time. Their reservation headquarters are located on one of the islands in the main stem, and so they're coming at this saying that they have the rights, the water rights, and sustenance fishing rights on this water. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the main stem is a 60-mile stretch of river on the Penobscot. And there's a lot of recreation on this section of the river, canoeing, kayaking, whitewater rafting, fishing. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved in this. There's the local people who have, properties right on the river. There's outdoor enthusiasts who want to come in and use this water to recreate. And then there's the Penobscot Nation. So there are two treaties that created the reservation, one in the 1700s and one in the 1800s. And the language in that included all the islands in this specific stretch of river. Over time, some of those islands have actually become submerged. So a big question in this case is who owns submerged islands, and is it considered water or land at that point? Past rulings of this is the federal ruling has seen that there's a reservation line, just a dividing line right down the middle of the river with halos around the islands. So again, for stakeholders, we've got the Penobscot tribe, we've got the state of Maine, and we've got local landowners on the main stem who are represented by the state of Maine. So the creation of the Penobscot Nation Reservation came from the 1796 and 1818 treaties. Both of those treaties came in before Maine was ratified as a state, which has been an important point in the water rights for the nation. The last ruling, Penobscot Nation v. Mills, the district court declared that the reservation doesn't include all of the main stem or the submerged islands, but it did grant the nation sustenance fishing rights. So while the nation might not have access to the water, they do have right to use the water. So the ruling on that just seemed a little contradictory. And the nation is, again, going for another case in Penobscot Nation v. Frey to try to reclaim their sovereign power over the main stem in terms of both the sustenance fishing and their water rights. So in 1980, Maine created what is now known as the Settlement Acts, which was two main acts that redefined and rewrote the reservation and Native American rights within the state of Maine. One of these was the Maine Indian Claims Act, and in Section 6203, they focused on the Penobscot Nation's boundaries for the reservation within the main stem. And the claim here was that only the islands that were directly identified in this act would be included in the reservation. It would not include the water or the bed of the main stem. And the result of this is that when the islands became submerged, those became considered the bed of the main stem. So the Penobscot Nation lost land through this definition. So the state doesn't support the nation's claims of loss of land, water rights, or sovereign power. They argue that the water rights belong to the state and go for more of a multi-use situation with this to ensure that local people who have land on the main stem, as well as recreationists, are able to come in and use the land, and it won't be just exclusive to the reservation. So there are a few previous rulings and cases that come into play with this. The Penobscot Nation v. Mills, which I referenced earlier, occurred around 2020. So I'll talk about that in a moment. Winters Rights, Arizona v. California, and the MRSA, which is one of the settlement acts that passed in 1980 in the state of Maine. So, Penobscot Nation v. Mills. This case was brought to the First Circuit Court in Maine and had a 2-1 decision. The main question here was whether the Penobscot Nation's fishing sustenance and water rights lay on or off their reservation, and who has the regulatory authority over the main stem. So again, this was looking at really the islands and the submerged islands within the main stem, and who had access to the water and who had the rights to all that water. So the state of Maine defended the non-native landowners along the river and said that they had the land and water rights because the Penobscot Nation had not exercised their sovereign control over the Penobscot River for many years. Another portion of this was that in the conclusion of this was the Penobscot Nation was granted fishing and sustenance rights, but they actually weren't granted any of the water rights. So while they could go and fish and get their food source from the river, they weren't granted or given accessible access to any portion of the river besides what's directly off their island, and none of the land was held for them specifically to have and exercise those fishing rights. Winters rights, which we've been talking about for this past module, were established after Winters versus United States, when the court determined that water rights on reservations had to meet the needs of the tribal residents and the reservation as a whole. So these rights recognize that tribal water rights began at the creation of the reservation. As I mentioned before, the Penobscot Nation actually existed before the state of Maine due to those earlier treaties. Winters rights also say lands cannot be lost by non-use or the non-exercise of sovereign power. That's actually been an argument on the other side by the state of Maine, is that the Penobscot Nation hasn't utilized their water rights or their sustenance fishing rights, so the land is kind of up for grabs in their opinion for the local landowners and recreationists. One important point that's a little bit unique to this case is this is an East Coast reservation. Tribal reservations are a lot smaller on the East Coast, and there aren't as many compared to the West. So there's no prior appropriation ruling in this case. Arizona v. California. The ruling in this case was that water rights, again, must meet the needs of the reservation. So the Penobscot Nation is arguing that their sustenance fishing rights are not being met, as they've lost both land and water rights within their reservation in order to fish. The MRSA is a part of the Settlement Acts that occurred in 1980 in the state of Maine. So Section 62071A gave Native Americans hunting, trapping, and fishing rights on all the shorelines and submerged islands that are within island territory. The language here is really important. They did actually say submerged islands or lands within the reservation. So in Penobscot Nation v. Mills, the court ruled that sustenance fishing rights and water rights that were provided in this act would be granted to the Penobscot Nation for sustenance rights throughout the main stem. However, the land rights were lost when the islands became submerged. So as the islands that still exist, that are still above water, are a part of the Penobscot Nation's reservations, then the shoreline surrounding those islands and the related waterbeds are accessible fishing areas in the main stem. So now we're going to get into the actual meat of this case, as well as Alaska Pacific Fisheries versus the United States, which was a case that was referenced quite often in the ruling on this case from the district court. So Penobscot Nation v. Frey held a lot of the same conclusions as Penobscot Nation v. Mills. There were 3 important arguments that really stood out to me while I was reading this case. The first is the definition of islands. So the court defined islands as only being any land above water, so it did not include any of the submerged lands or surrounding waters. So this did 2 things. One, it went back to the Settlement Acts, where it defined the reservation as only including any islands, none of the main stem or the bed of the river. So the reservation is losing those submerged islands because those are becoming a part of the bed of the river rather than land that they own. The second part is that this kind of goes against the previous federal ruling that the reservation is defined as a dividing line down the main stem and then halos around all of the islands for some water rights. The second point of this is, again, as I said, this is an East Coast tribe, so we're not ruled by prior appropriation. We go by riparian rights. And riparian rights of the waters are subject to state regulation. When it was determined that the nation doesn't own all of the main stem, just the islands, the water there becomes riparian. So it's regulated by the state. The third point was looking at sustenance fishing, and it was determined that there wasn't as much fish in the water that the nation was arguing for. And so the sustenance fishing rights actually would not come into effect because it's determined that there isn't enough fish there to sustain the nation anyways. So this goes back to the Settlement Acts as well, Section 6207 IA. And I'm sorry, 1A. And though the court does agree that the nation should have sustenance fishing rights in the main stem, again, similar to their ruling in the Penobscot Nation v. Mills, it doesn't believe that the waters surrounding the islands and in the main stem contain enough fish to grant those extra sustenance fishing rights because it wouldn't be able to sustain the nation adequately anyways. Alaska Pacific Fisheries v. United States was a case that was referenced quite a few times in Penobscot v. Frey. That case was really interesting. It was surrounding the Annette Islands up in Alaska, and the language that was used to describe the reservations up there included submerged lands and waters within the boundaries of the reservation unless it was otherwise provided by law. So the language here was really, really important, where the treaties and the acts that created the reservation up there directly included using language that said submerged lands and waters. So the determination of the language compared to that in Penobscot v. Frey was that the settlement acts only named the islands themselves, and they did not name any of the waters. They did not name any submerged lands. So the court used that as a comparison where in the previous case, Alaska Pacific Fisheries, they actually named the submerged lands and they named the waters, while in Penobscot v. Frey, they did not. It just included the islands. So in my opinion, this is absolutely a case of the state legislature imposing power over a tribe that has sovereign power over their lands. As I've talked about earlier in this, just because a tribe does not use that sovereign power does not mean that they lose it. And even though the Penobscot Nation might not have accessed those water rights on the main stem in the past, that doesn't mean that it's not included in their lands anymore. One thing that particularly bothered me was the definition of islands and the loss of the submerged island lands. So I looked at this kind of from an eminent domain stance, where the land has been lost by water, and there's no compensation by the federal government or state government to the tribe in order to provide for that loss of land. So if an island becomes submerged, it's not by the fault of the nation, and it should not be treated as land they no longer own or have any sort of rights over water or land. The land still exists, and so if that's the case, then water rights or some sort of submerged land rights should be implemented in order to provide them with the proper compensation on that. And then again, this is a violation of Winters' rights. The tribe has had land ratified by the treaties prior to the creation of the state of Maine, and just because they have not used the land does not mean that they don't own it. Thanks for listening. I'm very open to any comments or questions you have. This is a pretty complex ruling on this case and seems to contradict itself in a couple of ways. So I'm interested to hear if anyone has any thoughts on it. So thank you.